What if compassion isn't always a virtue? What if the survival of greatness depends not on an endless tide of pity and protection, but on a harsh, necessary pressure that drives some of us into becoming more than we were made to be? Sit with that question for a moment. It feels wrong at first. It feels almost cruel, and that is precisely why it is worth asking. Picture someone you know, or picture yourself. A person with a bright idea tucked under their arm, a private hunger for more, someone who speaks in half sentences about the life they want. Yet every time they begin to push, to ask, to show up big, a small chorus rises, "Don't make others feel bad. Tone it down. Why are you trying to be better than us?" So they dim their voice. They shrink their ambitions into polite projects, into safe hobbies, into smiling apologies. They choose not to stand out, not because they lack talent, but because standing out feels like betrayal of friends, of family, of the moral norms that reward humility and scold ambition. This is not a rare story. It is the quiet biography of 1,000 lives. We live in a world that praises the vulnerable, that teaches us to protect and uplift. We are taught to catch falling people, to mend their wounds, to shelter them from the cold. And yet somewhere beneath that instinctive kindness, an uneasy question thumps. When you stop the tests and trials, when you soften every edge and remove every obstacle, what do you make of the human spirit? Do you protect it, or do you stunt it? Friedrich Nietzsche asked this in his own way, and he asked it with fire. For Nietzsche, strength was not merely the brute force of muscle or weapon. It was a creative force, a capacity to say yes to life so fully that one rewrites values rather than passively accepting the ones handed down. Strength was the energetic pulse that drives invention, art, philosophy, the will to power that shapes the world. In his view, a society that instinctively protects weakness at every turn risks turning that creative pulse to mush. It risks building a culture of softness where mediocrity is safe and excellence either hides or is punished for its very appetite. This doesn't mean cruelty is virtuous or suffering the goal. Nietzsche's view is more complicated and more frightening than an either or moral command. He noticed with clinical precision how moral systems, particularly those born from resentment and fear, can elevate traits like meekness, self-denial, and humility into their highest virtues. When such slave moralities take hold, the daring, the ambitious, and the innovative are recast as a threat rather than admired. The society bends toward consolation and equality of outcome, often at the cost of excellence and risk. The result is not universal flourishing. It is a flattening, a cultural leveling that preserves comfort but sacrifices greatness. Imagine a garden where every plant is watered, shaded, and shielded from the slightest wind. At first glance, it seems merciful, but plants grown without challenge never develop deep roots. Their stems remain thin. When a real storm comes, and it always does, they wither, because they were never required to be resilient. Nietzsche believed that the storms, the struggles, the hard tests are not malicious. They are necessary catalysts. To remove them entirely is to remove the very pressure that forges strength. And yet the very suggestion that allowing suffering can produce greatness sits uncomfortably beside our deepest moral instincts. We are rightly repulsed by cruelty. We want to heal. We want to protect those who hurt. The challenge Nietzsche poses is not to become cold-hearted, but to examine the consequences of a culture that reflexively removes hardship. Is it possible that our compassion, well-intended as it is, sometimes cocoons people into permanent fragility? Are we creating a civilization that mistakes comfort for care and endurance for cruelty? This introduction is not an invitation to celebrate the strong at the weak's expense. It is instead an invitation to think about how societies shape achievement and stagnation through the values they sanction. It asks us to consider whether a lifetime of carefully policed comfort might save someone from a single hurt while simultaneously saving them from ever discovering what they were capable of becoming. In the pages that follow, and the ideas, we will trace together. We will not simply defend Nietzsche as an icon of ruthless will. We will step into his thought experiment, the possibility that strength requires conditions most of us shy away from. We will explore what he meant by the will to power, how slave morality in his critique undermines greatness, and why the path to the highest forms of human flourishing might demand a reorientation in how we understand compassion, challenge, and personal responsibility. Ask yourself now, where have you dimmed your light to keep others comfortable? Where have you avoided a necessary trial because the fear of causing pain outweighed the chance of becoming more? The answer to those questions will lead us into a terrain that is beautiful and dangerous, a landscape where suffering and becoming are braided together, where the survival of greatness may depend on our willingness to be uncomfortably honest about what care and growth truly require. The idea that strength is merely brute force, a club or a loud voice, is a shallow reading of Nietzsche. For him, strength is a kind of creative gravity, a force that pulls possibilities into being. It is an appetite for self-overcoming, a restless energy that refuses a fixed identity and instead seeks to invent itself again and again. To begin the deep dive, we must learn how Nietzsche names that force, how he diagnoses the moral pathology that tries to suppress it, and what vision he offers in its place. Each concept, the will to power, slave morality, the Übermensch, is part of a larger anatomy of human flourishing and failure. Taken together, they create a picture that is unsettling, electric, and strangely intimate. It asks not merely what society should protect, but which parts of us must be tested, strained, and yes, overcome if greatness is to arise. Imagine a flame. It does not merely consume, it transforms. It bends and shapes the air at its edge. It calls things to the light. Nietzsche's will to power is like that flame, not a crude lust for dominance, but a fundamental striving toward expansion, self-expression, and the intensification of life. It is the drive behind artists who bend reality into new forms, scientists who refuse to accept old explanations, entrepreneurs who risk security to build something new. Crucially, the will to power is not the same as domination for domination's sake. It is the impulse to enact one's vision, to impose an internal order upon the chaos of existence, to create values and meanings rather than passively inherit them. When Nietzsche speaks of power, he is thinking in aesthetic and biological terms at once. A composer's power is the score that rearranges silence into music. A philosopher's power is the thought that reconfigures the terms by which life is judged. Strength then becomes a kind of authorship, the power to write one's own standards of value and to live by them. In this sense, the will to power is what we might call an existential creativity, the force that makes novelty, passion, and greatness possible. But note the dialectic. Where this will is nurtured, culture flourishes. Where it is suppressed, stagnation follows. Nietzsche sees societies that celebrate comfort and equality of outcome, no matter the cost, as smothering this flame. They mistake preservation for health. The will to power, when genuine, requires friction and resistance. It grows by overcoming obstacles, by being tested, by breaking and then reforging itself stronger. If the will to power is a kind of affirmative creation, slave morality is the story of what happens when that affirmation becomes threatening to those who lack it. Nietzsche contrasts two kinds of moralities, what he calls master morality and slave morality. Master morality arises in the strong and noble. It praises qualities that affirm life, courage, nobility, self-reliance, and the capacity to say I without apology. Slave morality, by contrast, arises from weakness and resentment. It inverts values. What the masters call good, the slaves call evil. What the masters call evil, the slaves call good. Thus humility becomes a pinnacle virtue, meekness a moral triumph, and the assertive or ambitious, those who press forward, are labeled selfish or cruel. Why does this inversion occur? Nietzsche sees a psychological mechanism called resentment. The deep, simmering resentment that cannot be enacted outwardly. If you lack power, you are unlikely to enact revenge against your oppressors. But you can reinterpret the situation. You can say, my lack of power is not a failing, it is a moral superiority. You praise the conditions that sustain you, patience, suffering, submissiveness. You frame them as saintly. This move relieves the sting of impotence by converting it into a moral stance. It is a clever psychological sleight of hand. You do not change your power, but you change the moral map so that your position appears moral. Christian morality, in Nietzsche's critique, is a particularly successful form of slave morality. It privileges meekness, pity, and humility, virtues that Nietzsche argues often originate in and reinforce life-denying instincts. This is not an abstract philosophical rebuke. Nietzsche believed these values reshaped European culture. By celebrating weakness in moral terms, societies can come to protect it systematically, rewarding mediocrity and creating social incentives that pressure the strong to hide their strength. The consequence is not only the elevation of the weak, but the suspicion and slander of the strong. Ambition is called arrogance. Confidence is labeled selfishness. Originality is dismissed as affront. The moral language shifts from flourishing to consolation. Anyone who seeks to rise is told to step down. Anyone who suffers is told to be content. Nietzsche saw this as a moral contagion that corrodes excellence by making humility into the highest prize. If slave morality tries to arrest the will to power, Nietzsche's answer is the figure he calls the Übermensch, usually translated as overman or superman, though those translations risk caricature. The Übermensch is not a dictator or a monster. He or she is a creator of new values, a person who has undergone the wrenching work of self-overcoming. Think of the artist who, after years of apprenticeship and failure, refuses the comfort of received truths and decides to compose a new language of beauty. Think of the scientist who breaks with an orthodox paradigm because the evidence and the inner necessity demand it. The Übermensch stands where inherited morals fall away and says, I will no longer live by received lies. I will make my own law. This is a radical, lonely project. It demands courage, an appetite for solitude, and the capacity to bear the scorn of a culture that prefers soothing narratives. The Übermensch is not an ethical license to exploit others. Rather, they are an ethical exemplar of self-mastery and creative integrity. They exemplify Nietzsche's aspiration that humanity could become more than it is, not in some biological eugenic sense, but in a spiritual and cultural elevation where individuals take responsibility for shaping values instead of inheriting them unquestioningly. The Übermensch is also the antidote to nihilism, the despair that follows when the old value systems collapse, which Nietzsche famously dramatizes as the proclamation, God is dead. If old certainties vanish, must we descend into meaninglessness? Nietzsche's answer, no. If the strong among us step forward to fashion new meanings, the Übermensch embraces the void and makes art and law out of it. Philosophy can be abstract, but Nietzsche's ideas glow when injected into ordinary life. Consider two men at a coffee shop table. One is drafting a pitch for a risky startup that could change an industry. The other prefers the steady safety of his corporate job and applauds the first man's prudence from afar. Which one is praised by the culture? Often the conservative worker, the one who conforms, who bears no threat to the status quo. The entrepreneur is alternately labeled arrogant, selfish, or reckless. Friends whisper that he should settle down. Parents worry. Society, organized to minimize failure and discomfort, has ways of corralling ambition into safer channels. Or imagine two creatives, the visionary artist who insists on a new form that makes people uncomfortable, and the conformist whose work follows market-tested formulas. Who receives the moral pats on the back? Frequently, the formula-following artist, because conformity is comforting, predictable, and non-threatening. The visionary is exoticized, criticized, or dismissed as vain. The cultural apparatus rewards what keeps the social waters calm. These everyday pressures produce a subtle censorship, not the dramatic kind enforced by law, but the internalized voices that say, "Be like them. Don't make waves, don't be too much." The social penalties for standing out can be severe: loss of friendships, reputational damage, subtle exclusion. People learn to preemptively self-regulate. They shrink ambition before society can punish it. Nietzsche's concern is that an entire civilization can institutionalize this shrinkage, making it a moral duty rather than a social hindrance. The punishments are rarely explicit. They are moral suasion, narrative framing, and empathetic injunctions. When an ambitious person announces an audacious plan, the chorus may call it selfish, turning a project of will into a moral failing. In workplaces, trailblazers are accused of not being team players. In families, high achievers are charged with making others feel bad. The language of care is weaponized. "I'm only worried about you" becomes a social leash. Pity becomes policing. Consider the phrase, "tone it down," a polite, moralized command that functions like a leash. It disciplines the strong into invisibility. Or consider the celebration of relatability over excellence. We prefer leaders who are ordinary because they make us feel secure, not leaders who are extraordinary because they make us feel small. In both cases, excellence is discouraged in favor of emotional comfort. This moral policing is not always conscious. Often it emerges from a benign desire to avoid conflict or to distribute resources more equitably. But Nietzsche's point is that good intentions can have corrosive cultural effects. A society that treats every discomfort as a harm to be avoided will eventually have fewer people willing to risk the discomfort necessary for profound innovation. To fully grasp Nietzsche's argument, we must place it in the larger philosophical context of his time. Nietzsche lived in a Europe still saturated with Christian moral forms. He saw Christianity as institutionalizing a set of values that prized humility, pity, and the afterlife as the consolation for present suffering. For Nietzsche, these values often functioned as tools to invert life-affirming instincts into life-denying ones. Christianity, in his account, turned suffering into moral leverage. The more you suffer, the holier you are. The result is an ethic that praises suffering rather than seeing it as a potential crucible for growth. When Nietzsche declared, "God is dead," he was not celebrating atheism in a narrow sense. He was diagnosing a crisis. The old metaphysical anchors, the religious narratives that gave life meaning, were eroding under scientific and historical critique. If the divine guarantor of values is gone, what follows? Nietzsche feared nihilism, the sense that life had no inherent meaning. But he also saw a possibility. The death of God removes an external source of values, forcing humanity to become the artisan of its own values. This is both terrifying and liberating. It opens the field for the will to power to reassert itself, but only if the cultures of resentment and slave morality do not simply replace the old certainties with new consolations. If a culture reflexively protects weakness, Nietzsche warns, it pays a high cost. Mediocrity becomes institutionalized. Risk-taking is marginalized. The very engines of cultural renewal slow down. Imagine a scientific enterprise that cannot risk controversial hypotheses for fear of causing reputational harm, or an artistic community that polices novelty in the name of inclusion, or an educational system that shields students from failure so carefully that resilience never develops. The result is a society with many safe citizens and few creative leaders. This is not merely an intellectual lament. Nietzsche believed that civilizations decay when they replace aristocratic courage and excellence with comfort-oriented egalitarianism. The decline shows up in art, in politics, in the dwindling appetite for greatness. A people that prizes comfort over challenge will find that its institutions, technologies, and forms of beauty atrophy. The will to power needs an environment where risk is possible, failure allowable, and greatness feted rather than shamed. At this point, the reader may object, does Nietzsche simply justify cruelty? Absolutely not. Nietzsche is scornful of cowardly cruelty and of moral systems that celebrate pain for its own sake. His target is a kind of moral sleight of hand that confuses suffering with virtue and compassion with enervation. Nietzsche's ideal, the Übermensch, practices a rigorous care for life, an ethics of excellence that respects the formative role of difficulty. The point is not to crush the weak, but to refuse a culture in which weakness is given the prime moral status, and thereby prevents many from becoming strong. This distinction matters. Nietzsche's critique is not a rallying cry for heartlessness. It is a call to resist the moral inversion that masks powerlessness as moral superiority. He imagines a culture that can hold both compassion and the demand that individuals face trials sufficient to forge character. Compassion, in its highest sense, becomes a form of stewardship that encourages growth rather than perpetual consolation. The exploration of Nietzsche's core concepts forces a question that is at once moral and practical. How should a society balance care for those who truly need protection with the need to preserve the friction that creates strength? Nietzsche's diagnosis is harsh because he assumes we have an impulse to blunt life's edges rather than engage them. His remedy, the cultivation of the will to power and the aspiration toward the Übermensch, is equally demanding. It asks individuals to take responsibility for their own becoming and cultures to stop mistaking comfort for care. In the next sections, we will press this tension further. We will examine unsettling consequences, counterintuitive insights, and the dramatic moment where Nietzsche's theory forces us to reconsider the meaning of compassion and the price of greatness. For now, hold this image: a civilization that mistakes a warm incubator for a furnace. The incubator preserves, yes, but the furnace forges. Nietzsche's question is blunt: which do we want to be? What if our kindest impulses are secret saboteurs? Imagine a neighbor who insists on carrying another's groceries every day so that the neighbor's arms never learn strength. Imagine a teacher who gives full credit for half the work, so students never face the humiliation of failure. Imagine a parent who removes every obstacle from a child's path, so the child never has to endure a scraped knee, a rejection, or a tough no. These images feel tender at first. We smile at the thought of care, but lean in. What do these gestures create over a lifetime? This is the dark side of compassion, not a monstrous inversion of kindness, but a quiet erosion. Compassion, untethered from a sense of growth and responsibility, can become an anesthetic for development. It muffles the clarifying pain that sharpens will, and it converts important lessons into permanent dependencies. Nietzsche stared at this paradox unflinchingly. He did not celebrate suffering for its own sake. He feared a culture that so systematically shields people that struggle, and its formative possibilities are removed. The consequence is not merely individual frailty. It is a social architecture that favors comfortable sameness over the treacherous forging of greatness. Think of two athletes, one who trains under a coach who allows no excuses, who schedules brutally honest feedback, who demands persistence through setbacks, the other who is praised for effort regardless of results and shielded from criticism. The first athlete develops resilience, learns to adapt, to embrace discomfort, to befriend failure. The second accumulates trophies of consolation while avoiding the hard work of improvement. Compassion, in the second case, becomes an enabling system, one that preserves dignity at the cost of capacity. This enabling often masquerades as morality. We have inherited moral scripts that say, always help, always protect, never let others hurt. These scripts at scale create expectations that discomfort should be minimized. But Nietzsche warns us to ask a brutal follow-up. Minimized for what end? If every hardship is a moral blunder to be prevented, what happens to the mechanisms that produce moral and artistic greatness, scientific discovery, and political courage? We must consider the possibility, uncomfortable and easily demonized, that removing suffering indiscriminately risks removing the very trials that cultivate excellence. Suffering as crucible, not as punishment. Part of Nietzsche's insight rests on an anthropological observation. Organisms grow in the presence of stress. The deep roots of a tree form against resistance. Muscles strengthen when put under strain. Creativity often blooms from conflict and contradiction. Nietzsche generalizes this biological metaphor to a moral and cultural thesis. Difficulty, properly contextualized, is the furnace in which higher forms of being are forged. Where the furnace is turned off, what remains is a fragile ornament, pretty but unable to withstand real heat. This is why Nietzsche writes so provocatively about suffering. To him, suffering can be a teacher. It can reveal limits, clarify values, and compel self-transformation. When a person confronts hardship honestly, they are offered a choice: to retreat into resentment and passivity, or to use the discomfort as leverage to create a stronger self. That is the task of the will to power, to transform suffering into a source of self-overcoming. We must be careful here. Nietzsche is not the grim celebrant of pain one might caricature. He repeatedly criticizes masochistic valorization of suffering for suffering's sake, and resents moral systems that fetishize pain as an inherent good. His claim is subtler and sharper. Certain kinds of suffering, those that produce learning, that expose limits and invite creative response, are formative. Remove them wholesale, and you remove opportunities for genuine growth. The quiet tyranny of preventing every hurt. Modern societies have become quite good at preventing hurt. This is a triumph in many ways. We have reduced needless suffering, worked to protect vulnerable populations, and built institutions to provide safety nets. Yet there can be a quiet tyranny in the impulse to make everything painless. It often manifests as a zero-friction ethic. If something causes distress, remove it. If a person fails, shield them from the embarrassment. If a child is bored, remedy with stimulation. If a student struggles, provide immediate remediation that stops the struggle rather than the structure that might have produced it. The result is a generation, or several, who navigate an environment where the stakes have been artificially lowered. They graduate into adult worlds that still require grit, disappointment, and creative problem-solving. When the inevitable storms come, these individuals can be bewildered. The scaffolding that once buffered them is gone, and they lack the internalized practices for weathering hardship. Nietzsche would say this is no accident, but an emergent property of a moral economy that prizes immediate comfort over long-term robustness. Resilience, the empirical echo of an ancient intuition. It is tempting to dismiss this as only philosophical provocation, but psychological research, at least the broad patterns, echoes the idea that adversity, when not overwhelming, often cultivates resilience. Studies of post-traumatic growth show that people sometimes report increased appreciation for life, enhanced personal strength, and deeper relationships after weathering crises. Longitudinal work on development suggests that moderate stresses in childhood, like manageable responsibility or the experience of problem-solving, predict better coping skills in adulthood. These findings do not romanticize trauma. Severe trauma can and does cause lasting harm, but they underline a crucial point. The relationship between adversity and growth is complex. Suffering can break people, but it can also bend them toward higher capacities. This line of evidence parallels Nietzsche's ethical anatomy. Not all suffering is equal. The kind of suffering that debilitates and the kind that disciplines are distinct. The moral problem arises when a culture cannot or will not differentiate between them, and thus eliminates all hardship as morally unacceptable. Such indiscriminate compassion fails both those it intends to protect and those it inadvertently suppresses, the future artists, scientists, and leaders who need friction to become. How moral language polices ambition. Part of the social machinery that produces fragility is language itself. We live in a moral idiom that often frames discomfort as a social harm to be mitigated immediately. A child's tears demand comfort. An adult's failure triggers public remediation. A difference in ambition is labeled as moral coldness. These linguistic shifts create pressure points. Ambition becomes suspect. Competitiveness is coded as selfishness. Critical feedback is deemed cruel. When moral language polices ambition, it creates incentives for people to narrow their desires. If striving is likely to earn social opprobrium, then the safest path is to aim small. Over time, entire sectors can calcify into safe mediocrity because no one wants to risk the reputational cost of being too much. Nietzsche worried that democratic leveling and egalitarian impulses, left unrefined, could produce cultures that prize consolation over excellence. The process is rarely conspiratorial. It is far more subtle. Social norms evolve to prioritize emotional safety, and in doing so they inadvertently throttle daring. The suppression of genius and the politics of protection genius rarely arrives in a comfortable package. It might be abrasive, disruptive, socially awkward, qualities that a protection-oriented culture increasingly stigmatizes. When institutions prioritize inclusivity in a way that flattens standards or polices novelty for the sake of emotional comfort, they risk excluding the very deviations that might produce breakthroughs. Consider a hypothetical research field where controversial ideas are discouraged because they make colleagues uncomfortable, or a company where innovation is moderated by committees whose first concern is reputational risk. Such environments generate safe products, predictable art, and incremental science. They do not produce seismic shifts. Nietzsche's claim could be read here as a warning. The overvaluation of comfort and protection can become a political force that marginalizes daring and preserves the status quo. Compassion that infantilizes. There is another insidious form of compassion Nietzsche would have loathed. Compassion that infantilizes. This is the kind of care that keeps people in a perpetual state of dependency by treating adults as children and by assuming incapacity rather than potential. It misreads vulnerability as permanent and treats assistance as a long-term substitute for skill building. The moral harms here are twofold. First, the recipient's agency atrophies. Second, the giver's understanding of responsibility becomes distorted. Compassion is lived as an endless service rather than a commitment to help others become stronger. This dynamic also corrodes institutions. An education system that lowers standards to avoid student failure produces graduates less prepared for complex challenges. A welfare system that removes incentives to find work can trap people in cycles of dependency. Again, these are not easy problems. They require a nuanced ethical balance between support and demands. Nietzsche's voice is uncompromising on the need for that balance. Protect the truly vulnerable, yes, but do not degrade the environments that create strength. Counterexamples and the ethics of measurement. Of course, not every act of protection is deleterious. The practical question is measurement. How do we determine which protections heal and which ones harm? Nietzsche's philosophy does not provide a simple algorithm. He offers a lens, one that asks whether a practice affirms life's capacity for self-overcoming or whether it sanctifies passivity and resentment. Applied pragmatically, that lens suggests policies and behaviors that calibrate support with expectations, aid that is time-bound and pedagogical rather than permanent, feedback that is candid and growth-oriented rather than shaming, social systems that reward effort and improvement as well as compassion. The hardest part of this ethical work is humility. It requires us to acknowledge that our instincts for comfort may sometimes serve our short-term sympathies at the price of long-term flourishing. It forces a willingness to tolerate temporary pain when the larger trajectory points toward development. Nietzsche's discomforting insight is that moral parables about charity and pity, taken to an extreme, can produce a culture that reveres weakness. A personal, painful question. Now ask yourself quietly, where in your life have you sought to avoid discomfort at the cost of growth? Where have you sheltered someone, or been sheltered, from the honest tests that reveal capacity? These are tender, sometimes shameful places. But Nietzsche was not suggesting public humiliation as a pedagogy. He was insisting on an honest appraisal of the moral economy we inhabit. An economy where the instincts to protect and the demands of becoming must be continuously negotiated. As we push deeper into Nietzsche's terrain, the task becomes clearer and harder. We must discern, with as much wisdom as we can muster, when suffering is a needless wound and when it is the crucible of self-creation. We must resist the temptation to use compassion as a permanent safety net that prevents rather than prepares. Above all, we must recover a vocabulary that can honor both care and challenge, an ethics that cultivates strength without abandoning kindness. In the next section, we will bring these tensions to a head. We will confront the dramatic turning point of Nietzsche's argument, the assertion that greatness may require the displacement, transcendence, or even the defeat of the weak, not as an act of viciousness, but as the tragic logic of a culture that seeks higher forms of life. Prepare yourself. The revelation that follows is stunning, disquieting, and, for those willing to listen, potentially liberating. Here is the climax, the moment Nietzsche forces us to look into an uncomfortable mirror. Nietzsche's revelation is simple and seismic. The weak must be overcome, not annihilated, not humiliated into rubble, but surpassed, transcended, moved beyond. This is the violent-sounding language of a philosopher who watched cultures soften themselves into decline. His point is not a call to cruelty. It is a metaphysical diagnosis. When a society arranges itself to preserve weakness as an end, it loses the pressure that produces strength. The result is not moral uplift, but cultural atrophy. The only remedy, Nietzsche argues, is a reassertion of life's formative friction, a willingness to allow strength to test itself against limits, to push, to fail, to reforge. Hear the shock in that sentence. The weak must be overcome. It reads like cold doctrine. But listen closely. Nietzsche intends the word overcome in the sense of transcendence. To overcome is to pass through a trial and emerge remade. Imagine a smith at the forge. Metal must be heated, hammered, bent, and sometimes cracked before it will take a resilient shape. To protect the metal from heat is to leave it soft and useless. So too with human capacities. Greatness is not the fruit of perpetual consolation. It is the hard-earned harvest of tested will. This is the cruel beauty of the claim. Greatness is born in the human capacity to suffer, and then to answer suffering with creation. Think of every major advance, artistic, scientific, political, and you will often find a history of conflict. The breakthrough that reorganizes a field rarely comes from safe consensus. It comes from someone who was willing to stand where others would not, to risk reputation, to risk relationships, to risk the comfort of belonging. That risk is not gratuitous hubris. It is the ethical wager of someone who believes that a life of greatness is worth the temporary pain it requires. So where does this land for you? The idea is not merely theoretical, it is an accusation and an invitation. Ask yourself, where have you been lowering yourself to keep others comfortable? In what rooms have you muted your opinions because the sound of your confidence makes others uneasy? Which dreams have you folded into polite conversation because they seemed too loud, too ambitious, too dangerous for those around you? These questions cut both ways. Maybe you have been the one doing the protecting, softening the path for others until they can barely walk it themselves. Maybe you have been the one shrinking, apologizing for being visible. Either way, Nietzsche's turning point demands a difficult recalibration. To embrace the will to power is not to stomp the weak into oblivion. It is to refuse to make weakness the standard by which we live. It is to allow trials their place as forges of character and to accept that some discomfort is the tuition of becoming. Picture the small daily ways this plays out. The suppressed pitch you never made, the project you watered down to please a committee, the honest feedback you withheld so a friend wouldn't feel hurt. Each compromise is a tiny surrender to a culture that prefers comfort over creation. Multiply them across a life, and you have a person who never learned the costly craft of strength. Now, decide, will you continue to dim your light so others can feel larger? Or will you tolerate short-term discomfort for the sake of a life that might be larger, richer, and truer to your capacity? Nietzsche does not give a tidy moral program. He gives a test. In the silence after that test, what will you choose? We've walked through Nietzsche's hardest and most dangerous claim that greatness is forged in pressure, not padded in pillows. Now comes the practical and human part. What do we do with this idea without becoming cruel or callous? How do we take the lesson and turn it into a life that is both strong and humane? First, the simplest instruction. Stop apologizing for being strong. That doesn't mean flaunting power or trampling others. It means refusing the reflex to shrink yourself so others feel comfortable. It means speaking up when your insight matters, taking the risks your calling demands, and owning your ambitions without chronic contrition. Practice small acts of unapologetic clarity. State your ideas plainly in a meeting. Ask for a stretch assignment. Propose the project that scares you. Each small refusal to dim your light trains you in a new muscle, the muscle of legitimate self-expression. Second, build boundaries that protect your creative and moral energy. Boundaries are not walls of contempt. They are fences that define what you will and will not expend your life on. Say no when an ask would siphon your resources without real return. Say yes to what stretches you. A boundary might be as simple as a protected hour for work on a passion project, a weekly no meetings block, or a refusal to enter conversations that constantly belittle ambition. Boundaries channel your will to power into forms that matter. Third, seek challenge deliberately. If Nietzsche is right that strength emerges through resistance, then design resistance into your life. Choose projects that are slightly beyond your current reach. Volunteer for roles that make you uncomfortable. Learn a skill that forces repeated failure before mastery. This is not masochism, it's apprenticeship to a higher self. The point is not to court needless suffering. but to choose the kinds of trial that deepen competence, judgment, and character. Fourth, reject false humility. False humility is performative self-denial meant to comfort others. True humility is the sober recognition of limits paired with the resolve to expand them. When you practice honest humility, you acknowledge where you must grow and then do the necessary work. Cultivate a feedback loop. Invite candid critique, but distinguish between destructive cynicism and useful criticism that helps you improve. Let your humility be a springboard, not a refuge. Fifth, cultivate community that values becoming over comfort. Strength is not solitary only. It flourishes best in contexts that celebrate growth. Find mentors who will tell you what you need to, peers who will hold you accountable, and collaborators who welcome brave experiments. Surround yourself with people who prize rigor and generosity together, those who will push you and then care for you when the price of growth shows up. Sixth, practice compassionate rigor with others. If you lead, parent, or teach, try the hard ethic Nietzsche implicitly urges. Protect the genuinely vulnerable and challenge the rest to take their turn in the forge. This looks like support coupled with expectation, help that teaches, assistance that eventually withdraws, comfort that points toward competence. Encourage independence and resilience rather than permanent dependency.